Hi guys, my name's Eve and I'll be your host today. I'm here alongside my two friends, Jenny and Tori.
Hi everyone.
Hey guys.
So before we begin, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us and listening to our podcast. Today we're going to have a chat about mental health and how change and uncertainty has played a huge part in most people's lives since the pandemic. We are also going to discuss how you can move forward from the pandemic and continue to deal with change and uncertainty. With us today, we have our lovely special guest, Jacqui Rodgers.
Hello, everyone.
So today, Jacqui will be giving us some great tips on how we can understand and deal with change and uncertainty. So before we start, Tori, would you like to give our listeners a bit more information on what we've been working on the past few months?
Thanks, Eve. Hey guys, I'm Tori, and alongside my friends, we've been working with Headliners UK and the CoRAY team each week to help create materials which we can broadcast to help other young people with dealing with and overcoming change and uncertainty. So a bit about the CoRAY project. The CoRAY project is about learning from the pandemic to help young people's mental health beyond the pandemic. The CoRAY team worked with mental health professionals who shared with them tried and tested ways to help young people when you're struggling to cope with change and uncertainty. One of these mental health professionals, our special guest today, Professor Jacqui Rodgers, is going to talk to us about some of the strategies young people can use to help them manage change and uncertainty.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Tori. So, Jacqui, thank you again for being with us today. Would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Of course. Hello, everyone. My name is Jacqui Rodgers, and I'm a professor of psychology and mental health at Newcastle University in the north of England. My research focuses on trying to understand the role that uncertain situations have in the development of anxiety for both young people and adults. And I spend some time working on psychological interventions to try and support people who are experiencing anxiety related to uncertainty to better cope with everyday uncertain situations that they might find stressful or overwhelming.
What made some young people struggle more than others with uncertainty?
I think that's a really interesting question, isn't it? And, thinking about people that I know, young people that I know, and also adults, I guess there's people have different types of coping strategies to deal with everyday situations, and some people may have been equipped with more robust coping strategies at the beginning of the pandemic, or for some people things may not have changed quite so much. People's experiences of dealing with uncertainty in the past and learning from uncertain situations may have helped some people to be able to deal a little bit better with the changing story as the pandemic evolved. But really, I guess what's important is that everybody responds to uncertainty slightly differently, and that's okay. And it's about thinking about how we can support individuals to be less anxious about uncertain situations that they might find themselves in. We're not all going to respond in the same way to any situation.
I know I faced some uncertainty during the pandemic, and I was wondering if there's any you faced, and if so, how you dealt with it.
Yeah, there was lots of uncertainty that I faced. So I used to go to work every day. I had my kind of, work day routine. And suddenly I was faced with working from home, and worked from home for over a year. Didn't go back into my office, didn't see my colleagues, apart from on Zoom or on Teams, which is completely different. So the uncertainty about how I was going to do my job, and whether I was going to be able to manage and whether I was going to be able to keep things going was a big deal for me. I also have a teenage daughter, and so she obviously wasn't in school, and the uncertainty that had for her had an impact on me, and we had a completely different family routine to the routine that we'd had before, and so we were trying to kind of navigate that uncertainty together. I also look after my elderly mum, and I wasn't able to see her and go and visit her as much as I wanted to, and I was worried about her and worried about how she was going to cope. And just everyday things, worrying about access to to medicines, access to toilet rolls, access to, you know, all of the ordinary day-to-day things that previously had been just so routine and so predictable, I guess. So there's, you know, multiple ways in which uncertainty affected me. And I guess what I did when faced with that uncertainty kind of changed a bit on day by day. And I think it probably was influenced a little bit by how I was feeling and the other stresses that I was experiencing on that day. So some days I think I coped really well with uncertainty, and I managed to navigate it and felt less concerned and less stressed. Other days I felt really stressed by the uncertainty and quite overwhelmed by it. So I think it's important to recognize that what's happening in the background might influence how well you can cope with uncertainty on any given day, and it might vary day to day. I guess one of the things that I did, and it wasn't a kind of conscious decision, but looking back, I can see that I kind of introduced a new routine to my day, because I wasn't getting up and, you know, having my breakfast and getting in the car and driving to work as I'd done for years, many years beforehand. So I kind of had a different morning routine that got me ready for the day. So I would get up and I would go out for a walk and I would feed the cat and I would come back and then I would start my work in my office, and just try to introduce a new kind of routine to help things feel a bit more predictable than they did when it all began.
Yeah, I know you mentioned like about the routine, but is there anything else that you feel in the future you may use if things were uncertain?
I think routine is important, and actually being able to kind of, you know, establish a structure to the day. And I think for a few weeks, our days were really unstructured compared to how they had been. And I really observed that in my daughter, who is 15, that her day went from being really structured around getting up and going to school, and, you know, a very structured day, lessons every hour, and then coming home and having dinner and doing homework. Her structure completely disappeared. And actually, I think working with her to try and agree a structure in the future, I think I would have done that earlier had I known that would have been really useful. So I think, you know, planning for that for the future would be really helpful. Hopefully we'll never be in quite that situation again, but I think there's a lot of things that we've learned that we could use in the future.
Do you think it's normal to feel uncertain about school?
I think it's very normal to feel uncertain about pretty much all aspects of our lives, and particularly school. I think there's lots about school that can be quite uncertain. There's uncertainties around grades and exam results, and, you know, how homework's going to be received by the teachers. There's uncertainty to do with social situations at school, you know, which who are you going to be talking to? How are those social situations going to pan out? And there's uncertainty about changes to routines in school, you know, particularly, you know, in light of COVID. And, you know, even when schools reopened, they were very different places from the places that they had been pre-pandemic, you know, with classroom bubbles and lateral flow testing in school. And so there was lots and lots of changes that I think were imposed on schools that were kind of on top of the general routine uncertainty that is always going to be there in school as well as in other aspects of life.
Yeah, and how do you think schools could help young people to cope better with change and uncertainty?
I think that's a really good question, and it's a question that I get asked a lot in my work, actually. I think the first step towards that is actually to provide information to schools about the impact that change and uncertainty can have on people's mental health and well-being, because I think sometimes uncertainty is not recognised as something that can be impactful. And so I think the first thing that I would advise is communicating with schools, that actually looking at uncertainty in the school environment and recognizing that some young people may be affected in terms of their mental health and well-being by the presence of lots of uncertainty. I think that's a really important first step. I think secondary to that, actually working with young people who are impacted, particularly by uncertainty, can happen in a couple of different ways. I think where it's possible and desirable to try and reduce the uncertainty, that's okay. So providing some routine, providing some structure might be really helpful to help young people feel a bit more secure and that life is a bit more predictable. But I think over and above that, we need to try and instill opportunities for young people to learn that they can cope with uncertain situations and actually therefore not try and nail everything down and make everything absolutely predictable. Because if we do that, we never learn that actually we can cope in uncertain situations, and we can do that quite well, and we've probably been doing it quite well and just not been aware of it. So I think education for schools is really important, ironically, about the impact of uncertainty. But then I think over and above that, promoting this balance between providing some structure and routine to make people feel safe and secure, but within that embedding opportunities for learning, and learning that uncertainty doesn't necessarily mean the worst thing's going to happen, and it doesn't necessarily mean something really terrible is going to happen. And actually uncertainty can be coped with and can be managed quite well.
Yeah, I think that's some great points you've said and will be very useful for young people to hear. I know you've mentioned routine, so I think we can chat about that in a bit more detail and know what's in our own control within that.
Why can having a routine be helpful when young people are struggling to deal with uncertainty?
I think routine can create some predictability and it can create some structure in somebody's day that will help them to feel safe and secure. And so when someone is really struggling with lots and lots of uncertainty in their lives, as we all were when the pandemic happened, having some moments in the day when things are predictable and structured can actually be downtime. It can be time when you feel safe and secure, you know what's going to happen at that moment, and that can be really helpful to reduce anxiety and to reduce worry. So I think routine and structure can be really helpful for those reasons.
Do you think it's good to have a routine within eating and sleeping?
It is good to have a routine within eating and sleeping, I think, for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, there are kind of physical reasons why that's a good idea. So having, regular plans for eating, so eating at, regular times during the day is going to help to stabilize things like blood sugar. It's going to help to kind of make you feel, satisfied and nurtured, and all of those kind of basic physiological processes are important to mental health and well-being. And similarly, having a structure around sleeping and sleeping at regular times is going to help to regulate mood. And to reduce kind of anxiety that comes from feeling overwhelmed or really tired or really out of sorts. So I think for physical reasons, having a routine with eating and sleeping is really, really important. But over and above that, having regular meal times and a regular time for going to bed and getting up creates a structure for the day. And creates the opportunity for people to feel that at least at those times of the day, things are predictable and things are pretty certain. I know, from work that I've done with young people since the pandemic, that, one of the first things that happened for lots of young people once they were, doing school from home is that, bedtimes just went completely awry. So going to bed later during the week than they would have done had they been going out to go to school and then getting up much later, and, really kind of erratic sleep patterns and erratic eating patterns as well. And actually that can feel quite destabilizing and a bit overwhelming. So I think having these regular touch points during the day for regular meals and a kind of pretty structured kind of sleeping pattern can really help to reduce some of that background uncertainty.
If a young person likes to plan like I do, what advice and tips would you give them?
So I like to plan as well. I'm a bit of a planner. I always have a list on the go. And I think, one of the things that I would suggest is that planning is great. And planning, I would say that, wouldn't I? But, planning gives a real structure to the day. It helps you to kind of break down tasks into manageable chunks, and things can feel less overwhelming. So if I have a big task to do, one of the first things I'll do is go, okay, so what are the plans to get to that point? What do I need to do in bite-sized chunks? And that makes the bigger goal feel less scary and less overwhelming. So, I tend to buy myself a nice piece of stationery. I like notebooks, and I'll have a planning book for each different task that I'm doing. I'll make it actually an enjoyable process to actually plan. But what I've learned from my own behavior, but also working with other people, is to not really try and plan everything with forensic precision, because sometimes things don't quite work out like that. So having a bit of a looseness around the margins actually enables a bit of uncertainty to creep in there, and having a plan B can always be a good idea too. So I'm a great advocate of planning, but what I would say is don't try and predict absolutely everything that might happen, because life isn't like that. And, things do change. And so being able to be flexible around your plans is a really important life skill, I think.
That's some great advice. I think we can all take away some of that for ourselves in the future. I think next we can have a chat about accepting uncertainty and not avoiding it completely, which I know I'm guilty of.
So, Jacqui, should we always try and avoid uncertainty?
No, I really don't think that that's a good idea, and I'll try and explain why. I mean, I've done lots of work with young people and their parents over the years about the ways in which people sometimes respond in uncertain situations if they find that really frightening or worrying or anxiety provoking. And one of the key things that I think we all do, myself included, is we will try and reduce the uncertainty. That's our kind of go-to tactic if we're worried about uncertain situations. And sometimes that's fine. And we might reduce that uncertainty by either avoiding the uncertain situation or by trying to plan in a really forensic way for the uncertain situation. And avoidance and planning are okay. It's fine to do that sometimes. But I think if your only strategy in an uncertain situation is to avoid it, I think there are two things we need to think about. First of all, you can't avoid all uncertainty. The world has uncertainty within it. By definition, it happens unpredictably. So if you try and avoid uncertainty in your life, you will eventually come across uncertain situations that you haven't been able to avoid. And you won't have developed the skills and the strategies and the confidence to be able to tackle that uncertain situation. So for that reason, avoidance is probably not something that we should try and do all the time. But sometimes it's okay. If you decide you don't want to go into a particularly unknown situation because you're feeling really stressed about something else, or you're really, really tired, for example, then sometimes it's okay to opt out, to make that decision to look after yourself. But don't do that all the time, because you will never learn how good you are at coping with uncertainty, and you'll never get confidence in your own skills to do that. The other thing that people sometimes do in uncertain situations is they will, as I said, try and prepare in a really, really detailed way. They might go on Google, on YouTube, be doing loads and loads of research about a particular situation. And planning is a really good idea for a new or an uncertain situation. But if you over-prepare, then you might be setting yourself up to fail, because it might not be exactly how you expected it to be when you get into that situation. So some degree of preparation is helpful, but spending hours and hours and hours, searching the internet and seeking out information actually may make you feel more anxious about the situation, and it's time you could have spent doing something more enjoyable. So it's about finding that balance, I think, but not avoiding uncertainty at all costs.
How do you think young people can learn to accept that uncertainty is part of normal part of life, especially for those who are still in school?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good question, Eve. And I guess uncertainty is a normal part of life and will be for those young people. But, maybe we don't really talk about uncertainty very much in our everyday lives. And so all those everyday moments when people have dealt really well with an uncertain situation go unnoticed. And young people may have, a huge number of skills of dealing with different types of uncertain situations that they haven't recognized in themselves. So spending a bit of time thinking about uncertain situations that have happened to you in the past and how it felt and how you dealt with that situation can be a really useful and informative exercise for young people, because in going through that process, they will begin to realize that actually they do have very many skills to help them with uncertain situations. And that, when they have been in an uncertain situation in the past, it hasn't been disastrous. It hasn't ended up with something absolutely terrible happening, and they have managed to get through it and be okay. And so part of that acceptance, I think, is just recognizing the abilities that we already have.
What top tips would you give young people and your younger self on how to deal with the fact that the future is uncertain?
I think, again, this comes a bit down to acceptance, doesn't it? That, life is uncertain and we can't control everything. But when we do face uncertain situations, very many times we're able to deal with them very well, and to recognize that we have done this in the past and we will be able to do that in the future, no matter what the future throws at us. I think another thing that I would advise or advocate is that young people try not to spend all of their time worrying about the future and worrying about that uncertainty that they can't control. There will be some elements of the future that they will be able to have some control on, or some input or contribution to, and focusing on those aspects might be really, really helpful. So, you may not know exactly how you're going to do in your GCSEs or your A-levels, but you can still sort of look around to find out what different universities might be interested in terms of grades, or you can think of alternative career paths and actually do some research, getting information rather than worrying about, your future grades. I think also spending a bit of time in the here and now is really important. Trying not to, and it's easier said than done, I realize that, but, trying not to spend too much time worrying about the future, but begin to kind of think a bit about what's happening now and being in the present. It's a kind of characteristic of people who are anxious or who worry a lot, is that they spend a lot of time thinking about the future and worrying about the future. And, one of the ways to try and reduce that worry is to spend a bit more time in the present, although it can be difficult to get into the habit of doing that.
How can we look at the future more positively when things are uncertain?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think I spent a lot of time thinking about this. For my family members, actually, when the pandemic was at its height, because everyone was really worried about the future and, what's it going to be like at Christmas? What's it going to be like next year? And we actually spent a bit of time saying, okay, we're going to plan a family holiday. We don't know when it will happen. We don't know exactly whether it will be next summer or the summer after, but let's do some background research on where we would like to go and who we would like to go with and where we would like to stay. And we had this quite open plan where, we weren't kind of pinning it down to a particular week or a particular date, but we looked for things that we knew would happen again in the future. We would get to the point where it was possible to have a family holiday. And we did lots of research together, and it became really good fun, actually. So rather than worrying about the things that we couldn't control, like when it might happen, we spent time thinking about the enjoyable things, the positive things that we knew could happen in the future. And that really seemed to help.
That's great. What recommendations would you give a young person who tries to avoid uncertainty by making lots of plans?
So again, I guess this goes back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier, where I think planning is great and it's a good idea, but having some flexibility around those plans might be a really helpful thing to do when thinking about, the future and that things may be uncertain. And it's getting that balance right. There will be aspects of your future that at the moment, you can't predict are definitely going to work out that way, and that you can't be certain about absolutely everything that's going to happen. There are some things that you can be a bit more certain about, and some things that remain a bit of an unknown. And actually trying to kind of identify the things that you have more control over and focusing on those, and having flexible plans for those things that you are a bit more uncertain might be one way to approach that.
I think that's some good points. I know for a lot of us, future planning becomes quite a bit of a habit. So we thought it'd be useful for our next topic to discuss about living in the present and getting some great tips and strategies from yourself.
What advice would you give to help young people live more in the present moment?
I think it's a really difficult thing to do. And I think I spent a bit more time doing that as the pandemic unfolded. And I used a number of different techniques to do that. One of them was that I used a technique called mindfulness, which I hadn't really done very actively before the pandemic. But obviously with working from home and as I said earlier, trying to have a bit of a structure and a routine to my day, because everything had got very kind of unstructured compared to how it had been, I introduced kind of mindfulness exercises into my day, and they really kind of promote this notion of kind of sitting in the present and noticing what's around you and spending time actually focusing on the here and now. And I actually found that really, really useful. And there's lots of different ways that you can do mindfulness. So there's kind of more formal techniques where, you might engage in a mindfulness exercise, and there's loads of different things on the internet that would help you with that. I tried to do that with one of my daughters, and she wasn't having any of it. She didn't want to do this really weird thing that mum was asking her to do, sitting on the yoga mat, etc. She wasn't interested in doing that. But we did a version of mindfulness when we went out for a walk. So we would go out for a walk and we would just say, let's see how many yellow flowers we can find while we're out for a walk. And so we were actually really focused on the here and now. We were focused on our environment. We were focused on, it was a bit of a competition. We were trying to, and it actually meant that we were really in the present. We were in the present moment. And so in my mind, she's doing something very mindful. But if I said that's what she was doing to her, she would have denied it. But actually that is kind of, it's a similar kind of technique. So So there's different ways that you can approach that, but actually sitting in the here and now can be really helpful to reduce worry. Another way to do it is just to, do something you enjoy, whether it's reading a book or listening to some music, going for a walk, or even chatting to a friend on the phone about, things that aren't worries, then that, that will really help you to be in the here and now.
That's great. How do you focus on your present moment?
So, like I said, I still do mindfulness. I mean, I'm back at work now, and things are obviously, different and changing compared to when we were all in lockdown. But I've stuck with the mindfulness because I find it really, really helpful, and actually use it now if I'm worried about other things. And, it really helps to ground me. It helps to kind of make me feel more in the present and less worried and anxious about whatever it is I'm worried about. So I do a bit of that. I do a bit of yoga. I really enjoy cooking as well. And so sometimes I'll, try and I'll bake something or make something and really focus on that. And that really distracts me from whatever I'm worried about or anxious about. And I guess it's about, finding something that you enjoy and really trying to pay attention to it whilst you're doing it.
What would you say is the best way to connect with friends when feeling uncertain, and why?
Again, I think that's a really good question, and friends can be a huge source of support, can't they? And I think we've all realised that, particularly over the last 18 months. I think, connect with friends in whatever way feels right for you. So whether that's, face-to-face or by phone or text or email. I guess talking and being open about feeling uncertain can also be really helpful, and actually voicing some of your concerns about and worries about uncertainty. When we've done some work with young people in the past, helping them to think about the impact that uncertainty has on their lives, sometimes people are really surprised that other people are feeling the same way they are. And there's something really powerful about having someone say, do you know what? I know what you mean. I feel like that too. I think it makes it feel much less scary when you know that, this is a really normal way to feel. And we will all feel like this from time to time. And so communicating how you're feeling with friends can be really, really powerful and a really helpful thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that's all the questions we have for today. So thank you for taking your time out of your schedule to speak to us. For those amazing tips and strategies you've given us to put into our everyday lives to overcome change and uncertainty.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacqui, for joining us.
You're very welcome.
And stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll be discussing how adding uncertainty into our lives isn't always a bad thing, and how we can manage our negative feelings, as well as where to get the right support from. Until next time.